Welcome to the Outer Realm with Michelle Desrochers and Amelia Pisano. Airing live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 FM in New Orleans.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Thursday night segment of The Outer Realm. We are broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network, UFO Paranormal Radio Network, 105.3 FM from the Gulf Coast and 107.7 FM from beautiful New Orleans. We are fully sponsored by the amazing people over at Folgers Coffee who have been a part of our journey for the last at least 5 years. So thank you, Folgers. We couldn't do it without you, nor would we want to. Also, big thank you to Justin Snicker, aka Dr. Snick, the Sonic Surgeon, for the contribution of his music and his voice for the intro you just heard. He is an award-winning composer of Halloween horror, sci-fi, and dark wave electronic music, which can be found on all of your favorite music streaming platforms. Also, big thanks to Steve McGinnis, the artist behind the logos that you see here at the show. And he is also, specializes in the horror genre, but does amazing artwork, great commission pieces. My favorites, of course, pets. Yeah, he's awesome. So tonight we're going to be welcoming back Morgan Daimler, and she's going to be talking about her newest book, Paid with a Kiss, Love and Sex in Fairy Belief. It's pretty fascinating stuff, goes back centuries. Even the term paid with a kiss is quite interesting. And I'll tell you, there's a lot to this stuff. It's pretty awesome. So I had a little bit of a privilege of being made privy to the book, and it is really amazing. A lot of research gone into it. So it's going to be a lot of fun tonight. People chiming in. Hello, Dolly. Hello. Kat, nice to see you here too. Hello, Sherry. Hello. Hey, Kurt, how are you? Waiting for people to chime in, waiting for our guests to arrive. So next week, while we're waiting, I may as well just put it out there. It's going to be, it's going to be pretty special, I think. Why, you ask? Well, okay. Oh, never mind. I'll have to wait till after the show as our guest is here. So without further ado, everybody get ready for a really hot show. And, oh yeah, might even have to go to private mode, but hey, that's okay. It's going to be well worth it. Hi, Sebastian. Yes, it's going to be another great show, I promise. So without further ado, let's get the party started. Hi, Morgan. How are you?
So glad to be back on.
Yeah, well, just always happy to have you on. It's always just so informative. And this one's going to be pretty exciting.
Interesting.
Oh, it's going to be interesting. All right. So let's just put the book up. How about that? Put the book cover. There we go. Right there.
I love this cover. I have to be honest with you. It's probably one of my favorite covers I have for any of my books.
Really? Wow. Yeah. It's very alluring.
Yeah.
I mean, who wouldn't find this interesting? I think it's outstanding. It's beautiful. It's just beautiful cover. And topic. I love it.
Popular topic.
It is, but why? Why? What makes this? I mean, from the obvious. I mean, I've learned like right off the bat, paid with a kiss is like it's something that's not just what you think. This is a really old fairy lore statement, isn't it? Why don't we start there, and then you can maybe get into what made you want to write this type of a book.
I'm trying to figure out where to even start because it's such a
Yeah.
Like subject.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. Well, let's start with paid with a kiss. Let's start with just paid with a kiss. Like this is a thing in fairy lore.
yes, and that actually, this is where I was trying to figure out how I want to answer this, because that is a big part of why I wanted to write it.
Okay.
Was that I had a lot of people over the years, at least the last 6 or 7 years, who would ask me, usually in private, private messages, private conversations.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, for obvious reasons.
Can't imagine why, but okay.
But they'd ask me, like, is it possible for humans and fairies to have a relationship? Is it possible for humans and fairies to have children? You know, just all of this whole subject. And I realized that a lot of people, there's just so much, I'm not saying misinformation actually, but we'll say the way that we understand fairies today is so different from the way it's been for like the majority of the time we've had stories about fairies, that a lot of people do approach this as like, oh, I mean, I realize it's like silly, or I know this is impossible, but you know, and that's how they would phrase questions. And it's like, well, actually, as you know, having read the book, actually, if you look at the history of it, like this is a very old concept. This is not new.
Yes.
And it's something that people just used to believe. You know, there wasn't this filter we put on it today about how it's not possible and all this other stuff, like rational explanations for everything. You know, people would like take it at face value. And I don't mention this in the book because this is something I'd actually learned more recently, but there was a newspaper article from, I want to say the early 19 aughts, like right after 1900, where a man was being interviewed about something completely different and just mentions casually, like in the interview, that he is a descendant of fairies, that his family line is supposedly, you know, had this fairy woman in it a few generations back. But it's just in the interview, like just, oh, this is a thing, you know? And he wasn't like made fun of for it. He wasn't mocked for it. It was just like, oh no, this is, you know, my family.
It was accepted back then, I guess.
Yeah. There was this acceptance with it that we just don't have anymore when it comes to this subject. So,
but yeah, you see it in films. Look at Arwen and Aragorn. That's a real big one.
Yes, that is such a good film too. Well, 3 films, but yes.
Yeah.
And Tolkien actually was a lot about research and really based his stories on older like Norse and Celtic mythology and folklore. So again, he wasn't pulling that from nowhere. You know. So
exactly. And very, very old world. I mean, he touched on a lot of that, but it was a thing back then. People were so intrigued with it. And I mean, if you factor in now how people and how much even film gets into hybrids with whether other ethereal, beings or interdimensional, dimensional beings, multidimensional beings. I mean, now it seems to be a thing that's coming back. Do you think it includes fairy lore? Do you think maybe now is the right time to write about it?
I definitely think it's the right time to write about it, in that we need to have this information out there, because there is so much confusion. I do think there's more of, I don't want to say an understanding. I think there's more people who maybe feel connected to this subject and this possibility than would have been openly talking about it, say 20 or 30 years ago. You know, I have a lot of people, again, who will message me and be like, is it possible that I could have this ancestry? Is it possible that I could have this connection? That kind of stuff. And again, like I'm not a big person for telling other people what to believe.
Yes, like, of course.
You know, I'm never going to tell anyone you need to believe this is possible or you shouldn't believe this is possible. I just present things as this is an option that's out there.
Well, it's lore, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's documented somewhere. I mean, you researched it, you found it.
This is something that has been written
Yeah.
about for a long time. This is something
Yeah.
that's been in folklore for a long time. And
Mhm.
this is something that people do still believe today.
Mhm.
And I get to that sort of in the later part of the book.
Yes.
Um, and
Yes.
I did that. I'll be honest with you. Initially, I was not going to do that. I was
Yes.
just going to look at the older material and the folklore
Mhm.
and all of that. And then I kind of got like 2/3 through the book, and I was like, the problem I'm going to have if I don't add the modern beliefs is it makes it look like this is all historic.
Yes.
That this is all like artifacts of people 500 years ago believed this. And I wanted it to be something that would show everyone that it is possible
Mhm.
to still believe this today, that some people do still believe these things today.
Mhm.
That it's an active piece of folklore. Um,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
and I realize not everyone's going to appreciate that.
Yeah, no.
There.
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, I like to think we're fairly open-minded about a lot of things now, not so close-minded. We weren't here way back in the day. We don't know for certain, but I mean, things got documented for a reason. Something happened somewhere. So let's talk about the term. The term itself, I mean, paid with a kiss. And why did you choose that specific title?
So that was not my original title. My original title was like horribly boring.
Oh, no.
And um and I realized after I gotten so to explain this a little bit of this process just quickly for people that aren't familiar with like the publishing world.
Yes.
Um there's two ways to have a book published. You can write the whole book and then submit it to an agent or a publisher, and if they like it, they'll agree to publish it.
Mm,
But it's also possible, and a lot of publishers do this, you don't submit the entire book.
mm,
You submit like a draft or a partial manuscript just to give them an idea of what it's going to be, how your writing style is, and all that.
mhm,
And if they like it enough, they'll approve it, and then you have a certain amount of time to finish writing it, and then it
mhm,
gets published. So when I initially submitted this, it was about 50% of the book was done,
mhm.
not the entire thing.
Yes.
And I had a working title, and the working title was horrible.
Uh-oh.
So,
Uh-oh.
so yeah.
Yeah.
So as I got closer to finishing the text, I kind of realized like this is not going to work.
Mhm,
Um, and I had actually got on social media, and I think I had two options I was kind of toying with.
mhm,
Paid with a Kiss was one of them, and a lot of people had liked that one. So I
mhm,
went with it. And it's a reference to two ballads, the Ballad of Thomas the Rhymer and a ballad called The Fairy Oak of Coreywater.
mhm,
And in both of those, the fairy queen pays someone with a kiss.
mhm.
That's literally their wages.
Yes.
Um, and I
Yeah.
loved that idea. It's such a sort of romantic,
Yes.
kind of thing. Um,
Yes.
but I liked that it's intriguing and it gets your attention, but it also really summarizes what the whole book is about.
Mhm,
This whole concept of fairies and them interacting with humans in that way.
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
yeah, so
Because
that's what ended up named Paid with a Kiss.
now I love it because it seems to have these, a bit of a double meaning, like, you know what I mean? Like, it's sort of like, "Yes, I'm paying you," but it's kind of like there's consequences too if you don't hold up your end of it.
Yes, I'm so glad you picked up on that too.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, because that's the whole thing with these sorts
Yes.
of deals, which again,
Mhm.
I talk about this in the book, but
Yes.
um, everything has a cost,
Yes.
even the payment,
Yes.
and consequences
Mhm.
to engaging in this sort of thing. And like when we look at the stories, a lot of them are tragic,
Mhm.
and there's this idea that like, yes, you're being paid with this kiss,
Mhm.
but is this kind of like intimacy with fairies something that's really going to be good for you as a human in the
Mhm.
long run?
Right.
You know?
Yeah, because when you look at the Fae, they are I mean, this is the whole part that intrigues me about the union in general, because these are pretty superior beings in respects to being, these magical beings. Also, they can be pretty hostile as well. Like, not so, even Tinkerbell was cute, but she had a temper. So to see, why would they want to even interact in this way with humans who is like less superior? It's just like totally marring the line, the bloodline.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and this has been a question I think humans have been asking for a very long time, which
Yeah.
is, why? Why would the fair? I mean, humans want to do this, let's be honest, because humans like a challenge and don't always have a lot of self-preservation
Yes.
sense going on. Um,
Yes.
but
I know.
why would the good folk want to do this? Why would fairies want to do this? And
Yes. Yes.
I don't know that we have a single like clear answer, but
Yes.
there's suggestions that we find in the literature and folklore. One is that the fairies tend to be very intense with their emotions.
Yes.
So if they like you, and if that's a romantic sort of liking,
Mhm.
then that's going to be something that they want to do. They're going to want to pursue that.
Mhm.
And you, whether you like it or not, in some cases.
Yes.
But there's also this idea that the fairies themselves don't reproduce easily or
Mhm.
frequently, and that they don't have a large population.
Mm.
So there's this idea, both that they'll just steal humans, take humans to join their world to sort of bump up their numbers.
Yes.
But
Yes.
also that they'll take humans in order to reproduce with
Mhm.
them. And one of the really interesting things that I found when I was really digging into this was that across all the mythology and across all the folklore, there's this idea that like if a human and a fairy have a child, the
Mhm.
child is either going to be a human who's a little different,
Mhm.
maybe has like some extra charisma, maybe some extra psychic abilities, things like that,
Mhm.
or the child is going to be a fairy. Like you don't really see this idea of it being like what we would look at from like a Dungeons and Dragons fantasy novel, half elven kind of
Yeah.
perspective.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that I always thought was really interesting.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it is, because as you get further into the book, you cover what happens if things don't work out. So, but we won't get too far ahead of ourselves because there's so much ground to cover with that. So, do you feel, because fairies have this tendency to be able to bewitch people,
Mhm.
sort of thing? How much of it do you think is exactly that? Or do you think do you have humans specifically going to look for fairies? Is this something that's like a by chance thing, or is just a bewitchment and a bring you into it sort of deal?
It's interesting because generally speaking, and across all the stories and all that,
Yeah.
humans who go looking for this kind of thing don't find it. Like
Yes.
if you want to like go out hunting for a fairy spouse,
Yes.
usually that's not going to work out. It just doesn't happen.
Yes.
It seems to be more humans who are not in the fairy marriage market, who are not looking for these kind of things, that will end up in these situations.
Hmm.
And often when they're least expecting it. Like I think I did mention this story in the book because it is one that I particularly like, but this was something in Jacob Grimm's Teutonic Mythology, Volume 4, if anyone wants to hunt
Yeah.
down the citation here. But he tells a story about an elf woman, and elves and fairies and a lot of older folk belief can be both corporeal and substantial or not. So it's kind of up to them if they want to have a physical body or not, and they can go back and forth. So in this story, this man is in his home, he's a bachelor, he's alone, what have you.
Mm.
And all of a sudden, this sort of like mist or fog comes through one of the knot holes in the wood of his wall,
Hmm.
and sort of materializes into this elf woman. And she just sort of makes herself at home and starts like declares herself his wife basically, and gives him 4 children. They have 4 children together.
Mhm.
And then one day, the story doesn't say why, she just turns back into a mist and goes back out the knothole she came in through, never to be seen again. So,
And left behind 4 kids?
yep, and left behind the 4 children, which they don't always. In some of these stories, they'll take the children with them, but in this case, she left the children, she left the husband,
Mhm.
and the story doesn't even begin to guess why she did this, why she wanted to do this, you
Oh
know?
my goodness. Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah.
So, technically speaking, how far back does this go? Like, does
So,
fairy lore and human interaction go back? At least documented.
yes. I am not primarily focused on like Greek and Roman. I just want to be clear because I think if we're including like nymphs and that sort of thing
Mhm.
in as fairies, then it probably goes back quite a ways, 2 or 3,000 years. But
Wow.
in
Wow.
Ireland, at least, it goes back at least 1,500 years. That's the oldest story we have.
Mhm.
A story called the Extra Conla, The Adventures of Conla, where basically the king's son is just hanging
Mhm.
out with his dad and his dad's druid one day,
Mhm.
as you do. And all of a sudden, this fairy woman appears. Only he can see her. The others
Mhm.
cannot see her, but they can hear him talking to her. And she basically tells him that she's fallen in love with him because he's so amazing and so beautiful and all this other stuff.
Mm.
And she wants him to go back with her. And his dad is not on board with the plan.
Mhm.
So gets his druid to use some druid magic to kind of force her to go. And before she goes, she gives him an apple,
Mhm.
an otherworldly apple. And then that's all he eats for the next month. He just survives on that, keeps regenerating, and he keeps eating it. And then she comes back after a month, and he basically at that point decides he wants to go with her. So all of his father and all of his father's druid's magic eventually gets broken, and then he leaves with her to go into the world of fairy, never to be seen in the human world again. And that story goes back to about 500 Common Era, 500
Mm.
AD. So, that's a good amount of time
Yeah.
to have this story that specifically is about this, love and
Mhm.
romance between a fairy and a human.
Mhm. So, yeah, not trickery, in other words,
Not as far
So
as we know.
no, no, no.
Yeah. I mean,
So
I was gonna say
yeah.
you raised an excellent point right at the start. Like, how much of this can we
Mhm.
trust?
Mhm.
How much of this is, real as we would label it real? And
Mhm.
honestly, I don't think we know. The
Mhm.
term fairy itself used to originally mean like an enchanting or alluring magical person.
Mhm.
There is this idea that they can kind of mess with our perceptions, mess with how we sense the world around us, how we, see things. Uh,
Mhm. Yeah.
so who knows?
Yes. So, this union, obviously, it it is possible. Like this it can be a thing.
Yes.
You know. Yeah.
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 Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh,
It's. Oh.
no, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was gonna say it's one of those things in the older folklore, the cultural specific folklore. We
Yeah.
have actually quite a lot of stories
Mhm.
about this, about humans and fairies
Mhm.
marrying or hooking up, as the case may be,
Mhm.
and producing children and all of this other stuff. And it's really not until about 100 years ago,
Mhm.
20 years ago, that we start to see that idea changing. And we get this idea initially coming out of theosophy, which,
Mhm.
in the 1880s, 1890s, that fairies are completely incorporeal. They cannot be physical.
Mhm.
They don't
Mhm.
exist in a physical way. And I
Yes.
think that's where we start to see this idea coming in that, like, well, of course, humans and fairies can't have this sort of connection, have this sort of relationship
Mhm.
because fairies aren't physical. But even if we assume that's true, even if today we're like, yes, everyone knows fairies don't have bodies, blah, blah, blah. Um,
Mhm.
even in that case, we do actually have older stories and older mythology that still says it can happen.
Right.
The most famous like warrior in Irish mythology is Cuchulainn. for people who are familiar with like the Ulster cycle in Irish mythology. And he was supposed to have both a mortal human father who like physically fathered him, as well as a member of the Aishi, the Tuatha in this case, who also was his father. The implication was kind of like that one of them was responsible for the physical body and the other one was responsible for the spirit into that body. Yes. So he's referred to as both the son of the human father and also as the son of this member of the fairies, basically.
Yes. So, God, it just gets so convoluted. So, in doing so, I mean, there's one part where you talk about like the fairy queen, right? Because fae apparently can reproduce with fae, humans, halflings, werewolves, werecats, possibly vampires, different things if you go on and on.
Everything. All of the above.
So yeah. So nothing's off limits. We'll put it there.
Yeah.
But I mean, I understand why now, because you've described why they would want to have children outside of their own. But I mean, when you look at it, the queen, the fairy queen, why would a fairy queen want to step outside of her bloodline or race?
So,
because does it not have to be real pure?
The thing with fairies, when we look at a lot of the stories, is there is this idea, and I mentioned a little like they'll steal humans. There is this idea that they have the ability, however we want to perceive it, magic or what have you, to transform a human into a fairy. So we see this kind of described. So I'll give you two quick examples.
Yes.
In the Ballad of Tamlin, which is another very famous sort of well-known ballad, there's a version of it where so basically, for people who aren't familiar with the ballad, a human woman goes to a well that she's been told is guarded by this elfin knight, fairy knight, and the two of them end up being intimate. She conceives a child, goes back then to the well, and basically sort of calls him out and is like, are you an elf? Are you a human? So now that I'm having your kid, like I feel like she should have asked for clarity sooner on this, but
yeah,
she didn't. She waited. So
yes.
At this point, a little late, but now she's asking. And he tells her that he was born human, that he was kidnapped by the fairy queen, but that he was transformed into an elf. And he describes things that like would be impossible for a human, like changing his size, changing his shape, sleeping in a flower, things like that. So we have this sort of like this idea in this example that the fairies can take someone who's human and somehow transform them. Transmute them.
But there are large fairies as well, right?
Yes.
Like the fae can be human size.
Yes, and Tamlin is in the story, but he mentions, even though he's human sized as he's talking to the woman, he mentions being able to shrink himself down and change his size and all this stuff. We have another example, kind of the flip side of this. In Ireland, this was an anecdotal account. So this was something that was repeated as something that had actually happened and passed on as a story that way. And it was a boy who was, I think, 10 or 11 who disappeared. And 3 days later was found again. And everyone asked him, like, where have you been? Everyone's been looking for you. And he was like, what? The fairies took me. And for 3 days, basically, we're trying to, like, cleanse away anything earthly on him. I think a lot of, like, bathing and scrubbing. But what they didn't realize was he had a little tiny blackberry thorn underneath one of his fingernails. And they couldn't find it. And because he still had something of, like, the earthly world to him, they had to send him back. They couldn't turn him into a fairy. So that kind of gives us another view of this, where like if they take you and they want you to become one of their people, that's what they're going to do. So I think in some cases when we're talking about these stories about reproduction, fairy kings, fairy queens, what have you,
Mhm.
it's because they change the human
Mhm.
so that they are having a fairy baby,
Right.
or um,
Right.
yeah.
And so
So
how do the abilities transfer over to all the children, some of the children, none of the children?
probably some of the children.
Yes.
You
Yes.
know, we do have stories where the child seems to be very human
Mhm.
in most ways. We have other stories though, like for people who are familiar, it's a little
Mhm.
Shakespeare reference, Shakespeare's Puck, Robin
Mhm.
Goodfellow, um,
Mhm.
is a pretty well-known spirit in like English folklore,
Mhm.
and he's treated as a fairy. He can do all of these sort of fantastic things. Um,
Mhm.
he enjoys playing pranks and annoying people,
Mhm.
sometimes more maliciously than others.
Mhm.
But he's
Yeah.
supposed to be half human. His father was Oberon, who's one of the kings of the elves, but
Mhm.
his mother was supposed to be human.
Mhm.
But even though he's half human, he's completely fairy in the way he appears and relates to people and the things that he does.
Mhm.
So it seems to be maybe like a spectrum.
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
some children are more fairy than others.
Mhm. Yes. So if children stay and come into the earthly realm,
Mhm.
is it the same? Like, because I know, because sometimes, I mean, it's just like you've noted in the book, it's like, when the marriage or the union ends, like sometimes the children will have, they'll have the choice. Do you want to come back with me or do you want to stay here,
Yes.
with your other parent? And sometimes not. Like they just take them and that's it. There's no trace of them ever.
Yep. Yep. So we have some stories where the usually what happens that causes this to end badly is the human screws up,
Mhm.
just to be blunt.
Yeah.
Usually the human does something that they're either not supposed they've been told they're not supposed to do, or that offends the fairy
Mhm.
partner. They
Mhm.
they break a prohibition, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And the
Yeah.
fairy immediately leaves. Um, Sometimes takes the children with her.
Mhm.
Other times, however, does not. And it seems like when the children remain in the human world, they are largely human. Um,
Mhm.
like they're mortal, they live a human lifespan kind of thing, but they're usually known to have extra like abilities.
Mhm.
They're known to be like very charismatic, very beautiful, uh,
Mhm.
maybe have some particular skills. So like there's a family in Wales, and particularly in the 13th and 14th century, that was supposed to have been the result of a human man who married Gwragedd, which is a lake maiden. Uh,
Mhm.
and that the lake maiden, the husband, as we've established, messed something up. She left. She took all of her cows with her because she had come with a bunch of fairy cows, which had given him all this.
Fairy cows. That's kinda cool.
Yeah, um,
Wow.
they're supposed to be really interesting. They're smaller than mortal like human cows,
Yes.
but they give a lot of milk, and they're basically like good luck. Like,
Yeah.
you want to have them; they're good. So she took all of those back with her, but she left her children, and her children ended up growing up to basically be this family line that was especially known for medical skills and healing abilities.
Mhm.
Physicians is sort of the term that gets used.
Mm.
So there's this implication that even though they were too human for her to take with her
Yes.
back into the lake fairy realm,
Mhm.
um, they were still fairy enough
Mhm.
that they had this knowledge and ability that humans generally wouldn't have been thought to have.
Mhm.
So
They
I
were just
think
able
that
to the appearance was not what people would think, like,
yeah,
they could get away with saying.
yes.
Yeah.
And it's actually interesting because you mentioned the parents. I'll just toss this
Yes.
quickly.
Oh, no
So
rush. You got lots of time. Yeah.
there are accounts of these beings that are called selkies. They look like seals when they're in the water, but they can take off their seal skin on land, and then they look very human,
Hmm.
completely human underneath. And we have stories, particularly in like the Orkney Isles, it was believed that when people were born with like webbed fingers or webbed toes, that was a sign that they had Selkie ancestry.
Mm-hmm.
So there were certain like physical things people could have that were thought to be a connection. I've heard it said in some parts of Ireland that children who have like very dark hair and very dark eyes have like Selkie ancestry, Seal people ancestry.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Yeah, sometimes the appearance maybe gives it away a little bit.
Yes, yes. And that varies, let's say, from the Celtic to, let's say, the German,
Yep.
and, you know, Viking lore, all.
Yeah, when we talk about like Germanic, like Iceland, Germany, Norway, places like that, it's usually said that the children of a human and elf would be a little uncanny. Like maybe people would find them very strange, but also very charismatic. They're usually said to be like very beautiful, but like unusual beauty.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
basically they don't all look like, you know, your book cover. They might be part of like a leprechaun race.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of options out there.
Yeah, not as cute. So, which brings me to the next question: is it a specific, you know, are there specific type of fairies that are known for this, well as others? Like I mentioned, leprechauns. Is that a thing? These little dudes that.
So this is going to get so not safe for work now if I answer this question. So,
I'm just saying, because I read the book.
I don't know about any children being produced with human and leprechaun, but there is one particular Irish myth. This goes back about 1,000 years. The Adventures of Fergus. I'm going to forget the last part of that. Fergus, son of somebody. Where Fergus met Letty. There we go. Fergus, son of Letty. Where he supposedly was very entangled with the leprechauns, which all started when he decided to sleep next to a lake and they tried to kill him. And it became a friendship from there, as it does in Irish myth. But he ended up taking the queen of the leprechauns, who, mind you, is 1.5 feet high, as his lover. And I'm just trying to think of how I can explain this without being like way too graphic. Let's just say that in the middle of things, he put his hand on top of her head and basically was like, how is this possible? Because the size of what I'm working with and the size of you know,
got it.
And she has a really famous line, which I actually love. It's one of my favorite quotes in Irish mythology, which is the thighs of a woman can absorb a lot.
Yes.
So magic.
I'm with you, sister. I know exactly where you're going.
Magic can do a lot of things, I guess. Answer. But so when we're talking about like who this would apply to, it's a lot. It's a lot of ground that gets covered. Mostly the more human appearing ones, elves, the Ishi, Shua in Ireland, you know, Selkies who look very human, the lake maidens in Wales who generally look very human for the most part. Now, we do also have a whole lot of stories in Scotland about Kelpies. And Kelpies are shapeshifters. So their main, I guess we would call it, form is a horse. Please don't go into the gutter and make too many assumptions about that. Their main form is a horse. But they can shapeshift into a human-like appearance. And in a horse form, they tend to kill people. They trick you into riding them, and then you can't get off, and then they drown you and eat you. But in the human form, they're kind of known for like seducing people. And usually the story goes that the human doesn't realize that they're a Kelpie until after the deed is done, so to
Yes.
speak. And then the Kelpie falls asleep and the human notices like, oh, their hair is still wet, or they have little bits of water plants in their hair, like something that the human then is like, oh no,
Yes.
this is not a human.
Something happened. Yeah.
But we do
Right.
actually have stories with the Kelpies where, particularly male, because Kelpies can be male or female.
Mhm.
Particularly male Kelpies, though, would have a human wife and a child would be born. And then either she finally catches on to what he is by seeing him in his horse form, seeing him transform, or, something along those lines. And
Yeah.
then she runs away screaming.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did not sign up for this, and
Yes.
leaves the Kelpie with the infant. And there's actually a famous traditional lullaby in Scotland
Yes.
based on this story. And it's basically the Kelpie singing to the baby about the mother, needing the mother to come back,
Mhm.
and all
Yes.
of this.
Yes.
But Kelpies certainly would not qualify as on the more like human and generally
Mhm.
of these things,
Yes.
compared to some of the others. So
Mm.
it's a lot of variety out there.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love the legend and the folklore behind the Kelpies just on an average. So
Yeah.
this is just stuff I did not know. So now I'm just look at these things and go,
There's actually a story, you might appreciate this one, and I might have mentioned it in the book, because I covered a lot of grounds now. I can't always remember what exactly I included, but there is a story also from Scotland of a Kelpie who fell in love with a human woman, and she knew what he was, found out what he was, and he was like, well, I really want to marry you. And she's like, I'll only marry you if we can get married in a church, which normally they can't do that.
Right.
So they went to a wise woman, I think it was, and she said that if he wore this enchanted bridle, it would basically trap him in his human form. And if he could stay like that for a year without changing back into a horse, that he would be able to become human. And he loved her so much that he did that. He spent the whole year as a human. And at the end of the year, he became a human. He wasn't a fairy anymore. He wasn't a Kelpie anymore. And they did get married. So showing a little bit of that flip side, like humans can be turned into fairies in a lot of these stories, but sometimes fairies can go the other way and become human too. So
yes, which to me is like, why would you want to?
I was just gonna say, if I had a horse, I don't think I'd give that up.
No, because
like,
especially when you have the ability to go back and forth. There's a couple of questions. Kat had asked, do these people have fae abilities? Yeah, we pretty much talked about the children. Yes.
To a degree, and it varies depending on sort of the stories and what kind of fairy we're talking about. So like I mentioned with the lake maidens, they were very knowledgeable and skilled with healing stuff. A lot of times with the elves, they would have like an uncanny ability to know things, like know what was going to happen, know what needed to be done, prophecy, that kind of thing.
Yes.
So yeah, it seems to be a little specific to whatever type of a fairy the fairy parent was.
Yes.
To what abilities they might have, even as humans in the human world, these children. So
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, which would make sense. Next one. Don't Whistle at Night is a new podcast here on the network. This is
Good
Dawn.
advice.
Yeah, that's right. You know all about this. Well, Dawn is on the Navajo Nation out in Utah. So this is all kinds of stuff. I'm sure fairies are the least of his problem right now. There's stuff out there. But he says, do fairies who live in trees, do they get struck by lightning?
So there's a couple ways to look at this question.
Okay.
So I'm going to try to offer like the range of possibilities.
Okay.
For the sorts of fairy beings that people believe in that are more along the lines of like elemental spirits or nature spirits, if the tree gets struck by lightning, the usual belief is that the spirits connected to that tree would also be affected. Sometimes it kills them and then the tree dies. It's usually not a good thing for whatever happens to be living in the tree.
Yes. Yeah.
In some other points of view, they're not thought to actually live in the tree the way like a squirrel or a bird would. They use the tree as like a gateway between their reality, the realm of fairy, and the human world. And in those cases, they would not be harmed if the tree got struck by lightning. But if the tree dies, then they wouldn't be able to use that anymore. They would have to find a different tree, basically. So,
right. Which
it just, it varies a little depending on what exactly we're looking at, you know. As I'm sure people have already gathered from this episode so far, it's a complicated subject.
It's different, that's for sure, but I love different. So
yeah, the answer tends to depend on exactly what we're talking about specifically in this sort of broad category.
Yes. Well, I mean, when you're dealing with, ancient folklore, besides that, it's just it makes it very specialized, I guess, shall we say.
There's a lot going on.
Yeah. Alan says, the one creature that turns into a seal, a selkie, are they real? Yeah, like are they a shapeshifter type of thing, or it's just a folklore, like stories is just like oral history, or I mean, it always starts with a sighting or an experience, right?
Yes. So I'm once again going to give you a layered answer.
Yes.
Hope everyone appreciates the nuance here. So the word selkie actually means seal. It's an older like Scottish dialect term, selkie. In Ireland, they're called roan, which also means seal. So the idea is when they're in the water, you cannot tell the difference between a selkie and an actual real seal, except maybe how they act would be different. The folklore exists in a huge range of areas: Iceland, Ireland, Scotland, the Orkney Isles, all
everywhere.
Stories. Yeah, it's actually one of the more widespread things that we find that's fairly cohesive place to place. So from a folkloric, mythic, magical perspective, witchcraft perspective, whatever we want to call it, the argument would be that yes, they exist, but because they look like humans on land without their seal skin, and they look just like seals in the water, you wouldn't know one if you saw one, basically, unless you happen to see it taking off the seal skin. I will say, though, having said that, the rational, quote unquote rational, folklorist perspective explanation is that selkie stories could have been a confusion of people in these areas, Iceland, Scotland, Ireland, interacting with Inuit or Sami people who would have dressed in sealskin clothing and had sealskin boats, and could have, in some cases, in some areas, encountered Irish people or Scottish people or Icelandic people, and that the stories of those encounters would have then been passed on in folklore and become stories of these seal people as actual seals. So that is sort of the explanation you'll find in a lot of like folklorists trying to explain, like, why do people believe this? That's what they'll say. Somewhat supported by the fact that selkies are supposed to have dark hair and dark eyes, and sealskins. Certainly the range of stories goes way beyond what could be rationally explained, just with, it's a confusion because people encountered these other humans that they didn't understand. There's all sorts of stories about, the selkie finds her sealskin and then goes back into the ocean, but then as a seal is helping her husband, continue to fish to feed her children, things like that. That clearly you can't explain that as this is a confusion with a human woman dressed in seal fur, because she's not going to be living in the ocean helping people fish.
No, but it's interesting. It's an interesting theory. But that's what I love about folklore. It's just, that's why I say, are they shapeshifters? It can obviously be in the water, out of the water.
Yep.
And you get some that, oh no, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, no, I love the range of it, the diversity. And I love that we never really have any answers with any of this stuff.
No.
And
No, it's true.
that's why I've studied it for 30 years, because it's endlessly fascinating.
It is, but, it's everywhere, and it's like you find the stories, like, they don't go away. You
Yes.
just keep digging, and they seem to go back farther and farther, and everything is just so similar no matter where you go. So there's something to it. I mean, and anything that, I've researched, just even, looking at just ancient civilizations. I mean, even with the Fae, even when the church comes into the area, and starts dealing with the Druids, and the
There's
pagans, and
stuff up.
and yeah, and you had the Fae who lived among people at one time. I think it was out in, Ireland,
Yeah.
and got driven underground
Yep.
because the church turned the people against them.
Yep. Irish
So there
mythology.
there would have been this, right? Like, there would have been a close interaction
Yeah,
between them at one time.
there seems to be sort of an interlocking, um, symbiotic relationship.
Yes.
Um, yeah, The Secret of Ronin-ish, Alan was just saying,
Yeah.
he's seen a really great Selkie movie. It's The Secret
Yeah.
of Ronin-ish. I highly recommend that to people if you want to learn more about Selkies in particular. It's a very well done movie, and it's told as sort of this interlocking story where, in the one hand, like the main story, it's this little girl whose family had lived on this island off of Ireland
Mm.
and had left. And when they left, the day they left, her little brother disappeared into the ocean, because the family has a strong connection to Selkies. And it's sort of how they end up moving back to the island. I don't want to give any spoilers. Uh,
Mhm.
but in between this like main story, they have all these little like vignette stories
Mm.
about particular Selkie folklore. So the
Mhm.
story of like a Selkie rescuing a drowning sailor, which is something we find a lot in folklore. A story of a
Mhm.
Selkie bride
Yes.
who, goes back in the water and leaves her children behind. And it's so well done.
Mm.
Is honestly just a gorgeous, amazing movie.
Mhm.
People might also like, there's a movie, uh, and my mind just went completely blank. It's a cartoon. My kids love it. I should know this. But it's the story of a Selkie, a little girl Selkie, um, who her mother had been a Selkie and had left, and left the little girl and her brother with the father. Um, and it's sort of how they figure out, how the brother figures out what she actually is, and she
Mm.
can't speak, so it's like finding her voice is part of the
Oh.
movie. Uh,
Mhm. Mhm.
Song of the Sea. There we go.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Like, I should know the name of this. It's literally one of my kids' favorite movies. We watch it all the time.
But it's amazing how it's even integrated into these films. Like, there is so much that goes back, and it is so diverse yet so similar. Like,
Yeah.
all of it, no matter which part of the world that you hear these stories, is folklore.
Yeah. Well, and something you were saying earlier, I got a little sidetracked, but I want to comment on when you were talking about how, a lot of this, we talk about this like it's in the past, it's historic, and yet they're
Mhm.
still here. We still have these stories. And it's
Mhm.
really interesting because ever since like the 14th century, ever since Chaucer,
Mhm.
we've had this idea that just constantly gets repeated of like, oh, the fairies were a belief in my grandparents' time. Nobody believes that anymore.
Mhm.
The fairies left. We don't see them anymore. But yet every generation is saying the same thing for the last 600 years.
Mhm.
Clearly, they're still here. The stories are still here. The belief is
Mhm.
still here. But it
Mhm.
always gets presented as, well,
Mhm.
the old
Mhm.
people used to believe this. But of
Yeah.
course, today,
Mhm.
we don't have this belief, and yet we do. It continues on.
It's a huge belief. I've had people send me photos through the years, and I mean, I'm not a fairy researcher, so to me, they look like blinky little lights. But I've seen things that I think I told you the last time you were here, doing a ghost tour, and there was this one tree, it was like a big bush,
Mm.
and there must have been, I don't know, somewhere between 30, 40, maybe more people on this tour. And the whole tree lit up like little white Christmas lights.
Yeah.
And people were taking pictures, like somebody's got to send me this picture. So I don't know if they just didn't turn out, or was it just,
Cool.
yeah, like you could just experience it. But I mean, I was like shoulder deep into that bloody thing when the lights went out to see, okay, do we have a string of lights in here? What's going on? I'm shaking the tree. I'm in there, and didn't come up with anything, but there were so many witnesses,
Yep.
and the area was said to have fairies. And we're just talking like Canada.
Yeah. Oh, Canada, particularly certain parts of Canada, have a lot of
Ontario. Yeah, Southern Ontario.
a lot of beliefs and a lot of activity.
Mhm.
Particularly along like the east coast of Canada.
As well. Yeah. Well, Ontario is central, south central, close
Yeah,
to New York, right?
yeah.
Buffalo, New York, if you just cross over. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying like,
Yeah. Yeah.
obviously Ontario, yes. But if you get into like Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia,
They're all coming over though, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
everything moves around.
Yeah. I mean, Nova Scotia, New Scotland. I mean, we're going to have all
Yeah.
kinds of stuff out there.
Oh yeah.
But the belief comes with you, and I believe I believe that they are everywhere. So there is this crazy folklore, and we do see it. We still continue to see it in films. I look at Lord of the Rings. That's a big one. The Hobbit. It's a big one because they work together as they always have. And then you end up with division, but you see that there's this love. You see it going on throughout some of the different, not just Aragorn and Arwen. You get into the Hobbit, and you see, interest there as well. Like there's a lot of different like little hints that are given.
Yeah, it's a much more foundational idea, I think, than a lot of people realize.
Yeah. Well, maybe they're just trying to break us into what you wrote about. This is a thing. So go ahead.
I was just gonna say, well, that's part of why I wrote about it, honestly, was that, so many people are so skeptical and, approach it like, of course, this is just nonsense and silly and this can't be a thing.
Right.
And yet we have literally, 1,500 years or more of these stories and of this belief. And it really is only very recently that we've sort of decided, no, that's not possible. That's just silly. So it's a lot of
yeah, which again is interesting because I mean it's been going on forever, and all of a sudden we decide no, it's not a thing. But curiosity rather, I can't speak. I mean, we have more population, so maybe this is why maybe they don't make themselves as known, or is it maybe that we're just not recognizing it? Because you think you'd have more pickings.
So
just saying.
That's true.
Sorry.
I'll say sort of a two-pronged answer here. I do think you hit the nail a bit on the head there with that. I think so many people are sort of enculturated with this idea that fairies are tiny little winged beings, that if you saw one that looked like a human, you would not know what it was. You would just say, okay, that's kind of a weird person, but okay, they look human, they must be human, it's fine. So I do think there's a lot of cases where people maybe are having encounters and experiences, but not understanding it for what it is. Unless something happens that is just so out there that it can't be explained rationally. And I've certainly run across stories like that. I also find myself, because I'm obviously pretty out there as someone who researches this subject, like people know this is what I do, this is what I study. I have a lot of people reach out to me with personal stories, and it almost always starts with, I've never told this to anyone else before.
Yes.
And I think some of that is that we have such a rationalist attitude that people don't want to get laughed at. They don't want people to make fun of them. They don't want people to tell them that they made it up or it was a dream or whatever. So they just don't tell people the stories. And it's so weird to me because in the US, if you tell someone you had an experience with a ghost, or someplace that was haunted,
Mm-hmm.
people might occasionally be like, okay, that's a little weird, but
Mm-hmm.
there's such a level of acceptance with it.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yes.
if you tell someone like I went somewhere and I think I saw a ghost or a ghost passed through me and this is what it was like, people would be like, oh, that sounds like a really strange
Yeah,
experience.
but for a while, not at all.
Yeah.
They,
And a
they,
lot of people will be like, well, now I'm never going to that place again because I don't want to
yes,
see a ghost either.
yes, yes,
Or if you're someone like me, you'll be like, I'm definitely going to that place.
yes, yes, same, yes. But I'll
Um,
tell you, I mean, growing up when I did, it was like your parents are just like, well, you don't want to talk about things like that because they're going to think we're weird. Okay, well, we are weird, so it doesn't matter. But so it wasn't like I think everything goes in waves. But you're right, fairies is like way out there, and of course I'm
yeah,
mixing up elves with fairies when I think like the Lord of the Rings.
that's fine.
The
That's,
same, yeah, same idea,
yeah.
same family.
Again,
Yeah.
I'm making myself sound like I'm 1,000-year-old elf over here. Up
Yeah.
until fairly
Yeah.
recently, like the last 100 years,
Yeah.
the words elf and fairy were used interchangeably.
Yes.
So even in one account, someone might say, I encountered an elf the other night.
Mhm.
The fairy appeared looking like this.
Mhm.
And there's no like distinguishing the terms. They were just kind
Mhm.
of used synonymously.
Yes.
So you're fine. You can keep doing that. I do it all the
Yes.
time.
Good. So I'm kinda like, "Oh god, okay, great." But so let's back up a little bit. So if you do have a marriage or a union between, a human and a fairy, elf, whatever the case may be, um, and let's say the human decides he wants out or she wants out. This becomes like, what is the consequence of that, of breaking that union?
So here's an
Oh,
interesting commentary on power dynamics.
all right.
Yeah. If the fairy wants to break up with the human, that's what happens.
Okay.
The fairy never sees the human again or disappears or does whatever. Um,
Mhm.
and the human really has no control over that. It just
Yeah.
if that's what happens, that's what
Yeah.
happens. The
Yes.
flip side, though, is exactly the opposite. If the
Okay.
human changes their mind and is like, actually, this is not a good idea, and I don't want to be doing this.
Mm.
In a lot of cases, the examples anyway that I've looked at, you really have no choice. Like if the fairy does not want to break up with you, you are not breaking up. Basically, what happens.
You're trapped. Yeah. Because otherwise there's consequences.
Yeah. So for two examples, both one of these is Irish, I should say, one of these is Scottish. There was a man in Scotland who had a fairy lover, and she got a little too intense for him, we'll just say.
Okay.
And so he was trying to put an end to things. It was not working. He actually fled the country, took a boat across the Atlantic to Canada to try to get away from this fairy because he was like, I can't stay here. She's gonna be the death of me. I gotta.
Gotta go. Yeah.
And then the reason we know about this is he then wrote a letter back to his family after he had settled in Canada and basically said it did not work. And she had followed him and was still with him in his new home.
Oh boy.
So, again, clearly, like she was like, "No, we're not breaking up."
I'm the boss.
With you, yes.
Right.
And
Right.
we have a case in Ireland where, again, the reason we have this is because it was written down and preserved. A priest was actually called in to do an exorcism to try to get this fairy to leave this woman alone. Because the same thing, this woman had a fairy lover. She decided it was too intense for her. She didn't want to deal with it. The fairy was like, well, I disagree. I'm not going anywhere. And it actually got to the point where a Catholic priest was called in and did this whole exorcism, specifically of a Lonnan she, which is a term in Irish. It means like fairy lover, fairy sweetheart.
Mhm.
We don't know if it worked because that part they didn't record. They just recorded the prayer that he said, the exorcism prayer that he said, and then a little bit of what was going on and why he was doing it.
Mhm.
So I don't know if that worked any better than fleeing across the Atlantic, but
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
does kind of show you that like the woman wanted out and the fairy was like, no.
It's not a thing. It's not a thing.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. That's just like a bad stalker. But okay.
I know.
So like no, I'm gonna be there forever. Forever. Because okay, let's talk lifespans. Because this brings me to think like, they can outlive you by how long? So then what? Do they follow you in spirit? Do they,
So obviously the folklore and the mythology doesn't give us a firm answer here.
right.
There are some implications in some of the stories that if the human dies, they didn't actually die, they were taken into the world of fairy. Basically the fairy decided to keep them forever.
Yes.
Yeah, there are certainly modern beliefs, like people I've talked to in the last 10 years, who feel that there can be like a spirit attachment, a spirit connection, where if the human is reborn, if you believe in reincarnation,
Yes.
the human is reborn into a new form, the fairy recognizes that spirit, even in a different body. And I have talked to people who believe that they have like past life relationships with a fairy that then, renewed themselves in the current life kind of a situation. So there certainly is an implication that just because humans are mortal and only get a certain amount of time does not necessarily put a limit on the relationship time-wise.
Right.
We don't know how immortal fairies actually are. They can be killed. We have stories about that, like violently injured and killed. But they generally don't die of sickness or old age or things like that. So,
yes.
Yeah.
So we don't really know how long they're there. But it is fascinating that there are accounts of past lives.
Yeah. This, again, it gets into like, if you don't believe in past lives, then you don't believe in past lives.
Yes.
If you do, if you believe in reincarnation, then there's certainly this idea that they can stay with you across lifetimes. Because
so if you're the poor guy or girl who's trying to get away from the fairy,
you got problems.
See, so
you got problems.
Yeah,
I know everyone keeps jumping back on this.
Elves and fairies. I love Alan's comment, because if you don't use the word elf and fairies being the same, they really don't know what they're talking about. I know.
So
me too.
Here's the thing.
Me.
In a modern context, we have kind of decided in English, particularly in the US, that elf is a particular type of being, like Tolkien's elves and Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
Looks fairly human, pointed ears, beautiful, all that. Whereas fairies are something different. Again, usually pop culture perceived as tiny and winged. Think Tinkerbell. The thing to understand is that they're historically speaking here, they are two words from two different languages that meant the same thing originally. So elf comes from Anglo-Saxon into English, and then fairy comes from French, fae, also into English. Fairy came into English to replace the word elf because it was thought you shouldn't say elf or it'll get their attention, and you don't always want that. And then that came to then be applied to fairy, where you're not supposed to say fairy or you might get their attention and it'll offend them. Obviously, I love dangerously because I say both of them all the time. But this is why when I say that historically they were used interchangeably, that's why. Because one was a Germanic word and one was a French word for the exact same type of spirit originally. In Scotland, you would see, like if you read older material, they would always talk about elves. Everything was elves. In Ireland, they use the word fairies, but they're still talking about the same thing. Like if you look at the Irish language and the Scottish language, terms are identical. And I'm not going to bore everyone too much with linguistics, I promise. But it's just kind of important to understand that our modern understanding of the word
feel free,
little different than sort of the historic. And because most of my focus is on the historic material, I basically exist 500 years ago in my brain. So
No, that's okay. It's why you're here. No, this is a lot to take in because
It's a
I
big
thought
subject.
it is, but it is a big subject, but it's so fascinating because it's like one of the first, I think, again, spanning literally the world. It is one of those first otherworldly beings that were
Yeah.
openly spoken about.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
No,
don't
and
hear a lot of people talking about reptilians and grays back there, even though you see a lot of petroglyphs and ancient monuments that state it. It wasn't openly spoken about much like this.
not as much. And that obviously is not my main area of
Yes,
expertise, but
yes.
like I know that there's artwork, very old artwork and illustrations in books that
Mhm,
seem to show things that can be interpreted as like UFOs or aliens and different alien technology, maybe.
mhm.
So, how far back all that goes is really difficult to say.
Yeah, who knows?
And as I
It goes back, yeah.
I'm
It goes
sure I
back.
have mentioned this on previous shows because
Yes,
it tends to come up as a subject, but the
yes,
argument between people who study fairies and people who study like UFOs and aliens about whether historic fairies are actually aliens or
yes,
modern aliens are actually fairies will
yes.
never end.
No, it's true.
It's
It's
a
true.
perpetual discussion. Yeah.
Yes, yes. But I mean, ethereal beings. I mean, I mean, has this always been their home? We don't know.
Yeah.
We, don't- you know, we don't know. It's just it's interesting to think so. But I mean, a lot of beings come through portals, and that would include, one of my personal favorites, like dragons.
I actually love that the more modern understanding that we're finding more today
Mhm.
of fairies, because originally, of course, fairies were beings who came from the land of fairy, the other
Yes.
world, this distinct world or dimension.
Mhm.
But we're increasingly kind of seeing people, particularly in these sorts of discussions, talking about them as extra dimensional or interdimensional beings,
Yes. Yes.
as opposed to this completely separate world as
Mhm.
we understood before. Uh,
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
clearly very strongly tied to our world.
Mhm.
You just don't understand how.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But there are so many amazingly gifted people out there who see
Yeah.
all of this, and I've worked with incredible people who, have even remote viewed and come across and, "Oh, hey, there are a bunch of fairies over here," like in this area, and I'm just like, wow, that's crazy. And then, I've got, friends in this part of the world, for example, who I've said, you need to go here and tell me what you think. Also gifted people go there and go, holy shit, there's fairies over here. I'm like, well, this is
What's going
good.
on?
It was a good validation,
Yeah.
to each. So they are definitely there and they are being seen or
I
allowing themselves to be seen.
I read a novel years ago, and the premise of the novel was basically that humans developed a technology that
Yeah.
could create a gateway into the world of fairy, basically,
Mhm.
um, in this world. And this was not at all magical on the human end. We literally figured out with physics and all that science
Mhm.
that I don't understand how to use technology to build this portal and then go into this world where magic was real and elves were real and all this other
Mhm.
stuff. And I would not be personally surprised at some point, 5 years, 10 years, 100 years from now, if that actually happens and we figure out some way to use our technology to
Mhm.
access this interdimensional, extra dimensional, whatever we want to call
It's definitely
it.
happening because, I mean, there are scientists, I think it was with, CERN,
Yeah.
who came forward, who claimed that there were different beings coming through a portal.
Yeah. I
So,
like
we can open up portals. We are portals. So
yeah.
so anything, I mean, with the right energy, the right frequency, the right vibe, it's
At some point, science will catch up with it. Well,
oh, yeah.
look at, if people who do paranormal research, the technology we have today to
Mhm,
record things like EVPs and
mhm,
all this
mhm,
other stuff. 100 years ago, if you
mhm.
told someone that was possible, they would say that's science fiction. That's not, you can't do that.
Yes,
Like,
yes.
it's
No,
not
it's
possible
true.
to contact ghosts with machines.
I
And yet
know,
here we
I
are
know.
today.
Yes, yes. I love it though. But I mean, you look at it, Tesla did it,
Yeah. There's
you know,
there's a lot more out
Edison
there.
did it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Marconi
that
did it.
it's just a matter of us
Yeah.
figuring out the frequencies and what we
Hmm.
need, the mechanics of it all.
Hmm.
Um,
I
so
agree
yeah,
with you. So what's the difference then in between the accounts, let's say in folklore and modern times? Or are there any differences?
sure. So the older accounts from mythology through say 100 years ago
Hmm.
are surprisingly consistent in sort of what we find.
Hmm.
Um, we see this sort of idea that, um, as I said, fairies can be insubstantial or they can be physical. They can interact with humans. They often will look very human. They can reproduce with humans. Like all of this is sort of what we find.
Hmm.
When we were talking earlier about how the human messes something up and then they lose the fairy spouse, usually what that hinges on is there's a prohibition that the
Hmm.
human can't do. And often, not always, but often it's silence. You're not supposed to tell other people, other humans, that
Hmm.
you have this relationship or this fairy wife or fairy husband or what have you.
Hmm.
Um, the biggest difference I find today, talking to people across again the last 5 to 10 years, um, who engage actively with this,
Hmm.
it's usually people in like the witchcraft or pagan communities, is they do not view the fairy or the elf or whatever as physically tangible. It's
Hmm.
not a being that other humans can see with their eyes or touch. It's usually a spirit that's encountered in dreams or trance states
Hmm.
or things like that. Um, and there doesn't seem, for the vast majority of people, to be any of these prohibitions.
Hmm.
So there's quite a few people at this point who are now writing about having this relationship or this connection.
Hmm.
And you'll remember in the book, I actually cite a couple. One is a blog by a person named Blythe Reimer, The Raven and the Lotus, I think is what it's called. And then there's a book whose name I'm not going to remember. The author is Arden Ariana. And in both of them, the people are talking about they feel like they have this fairy lover, this fairy spouse. They have a past life connection
Hmm.
to them. Other people cannot physically see them, but the person can communicate with them in other various ways.
Hmm.
They're not physically present in our world, but they,
Hmm.
are spiritually present, I guess we'll say,
Yes. Yes.
metaphysically present.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think that probably the biggest change is the lack of physical form, because that just used to be accepted
Hmm.
historically. That, and when I say historically, I should say that like literally up until like the 1900s,
Hmm.
there's
Before
actually
the wide age of media and so where people were being, I think, labeled like or
yeah
the situation or ooh, fairies like ridicule. A lot changed around the Roswell days, like
yeah
so much like you can't talk about things like that. They're really watching what everybody was saying. But in the 1900s, you still came into the age of spiritualism, late 1800s, early
yes
1900s. So it was game on. They were so into it, right?
yeah. There was much more of an idea of um, the reality
Yes.
of all of those things: ghosts,
Yes.
fairies, spirits, all sorts
Yes.
of things.
Yes.
Yeah, we've definitely lost that to a big degree.
Yes. But I think just to the people who've, I mean, you have so many people who contact you through the, couple of decades that I've been in research, people have, contacted me and said, "Look, this is there. I see them all the time."
Mhm.
And it's just like, I wish I had known you then because I really didn't know anybody who specifically dealt, for example, in fairies or elves or, gnomes or like leprechauns or in this whole realm, even though I was aware of some of the stories,
Yeah,
especially those pesky little gnomes.
I realized
Oh.
about, I was gonna say 10 years, but I think it's actually been more like 15 at this point.
Mhm.
Um, no, I take that back. I taught my first public class, or gave my first public lecture about fairies in 2000.
Mhm.
So 25 years ago, I do not like that that's how long ago that was, but
Yeah.
that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
I realized apparently
Mhm.
25 years ago that not a lot of people were talking about this, that not a lot of people would publicly come forward and say they'd had experiences. Privately, they would, but not publicly.
Mhm.
And I just made a decision that, you know what? People who believe me are going to believe me. People who don't believe any of this is real aren't going to care what I say
Yeah.
because they're going to think it's all nonsense anyway. And if people want to judge me and think that I'm, crazy for being interested in this or talking about
Mhm.
this, then I have no control over that.
Mhm.
But it's stuff that needs to be said.
Mhm.
And I'm really glad that I made that decision because, like I mentioned, I have so many people who come up to me privately that will say, I never told anyone this before because
Mhm.
they're afraid people will make fun of them or think
Mhm.
they're crazy. And I'm like,
Mhm.
you come to the right person because I'm not going to make fun of you and I don't think you're crazy. So
Yeah, and I myself may just be a little crazy. Yeah.
I
No,
think
no.
I think we all have a healthy dose of
Healthy doses are good though. But
yeah.
do you think maybe it's because people are actually open and maybe want to believe in that little bit of magic now that they're opening themselves up to the possibility of all these different beings that they're sharing space with potentially because there are still sightings.
I hope that's the case. I hope that's what's going on. Um,
Mhm.
I think I think we kind of like culturally went from a place where we were way too
Mhm.
credulous. We weren't skeptical enough. Like everyone just
Mhm.
believed everything, which is
Mhm.
not good. But I think we swung way too far the other way, where
Mhm.
now everything has to be rationally explained. Everything has
Mhm.
to be, oh, what's that
Mhm.
expression that was going around social media years ago? A picture, it didn't happen. If you
Yeah.
can't prove it, if you don't have solid evidence, then we just don't believe in it, and it's mass delusion or it's whatever. And
Mhm.
I think there's got to be a happy medium,
Yeah.
where we can be skeptical but also open to the possibilities.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah. Mhm.
and I'll give you a quick example. So I do believe that I've heard fairy music before. I
Oh.
have been in a situation where I was somewhere and I heard music and it had no possible logical origin. And
Mhm.
it also wasn't any kind of music I'd ever heard before, anything I can actually really describe very well.
Mhm.
It was beautiful, but it was
I'm
very
I'm curious because I've heard all kinds of different musics, like,
yeah,
just
yeah, just hearing it.
while being awake, out of
Yeah,
nowhere.
yeah. Oh, no, I was awake.
Yeah, me too, yeah.
It was very strange,
Yeah,
and I believe it was fairy music. Obviously, other
okay.
people can draw their own conclusions.
Yeah.
In contrast, however, I have been home and heard what sounded like music that I couldn't quite I couldn't hear it really well,
Mm.
a little bit,
Mhm.
and I had a moment where I was like, "Is that fairy music? What's happening?" And no, it was just my MP3 player had accidentally gotten turned on, and it was playing through the headphones.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
figured that out. I was like, "Oh,
Darn
okay."
it. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think we can have a healthy balance between those 2 things. You can be
Yeah.
skeptical enough to be like, "No, actually, this is the explanation. I figured it out."
Mhm.
While also being open enough to be like, "I tried and there is no explanation for this
Mhm.
experience I had.
Mhm.
It is something
Yeah.
unexplainable."
Adrian says, "I have multiple videos of lights and trees and intelligent moving lights. So how does one tell the difference between, let's say, a sprite and a fairy, or are they all the same?"
So, for the modern definition of fairy, if we're saying fairies are like the little Tinkerbell things, then a fairy and a sprite would effectively be the same things.
Mm.
Um, there's not going to be a ton of difference between how those two are understood
Mhm.
with that definition of fairy. If we're going with the definition of fairy we find in, say, Ireland,
Mm.
or Scotland today, places like that, then a fairy is going to be used as a bit of a catch-all term. So you would call something a fairy that might also be a more specific sort of thing. It's used like as a general term.
Mhm.
But like in Ireland, if you say that you saw a fairy, in most places in Ireland, I should say, the assumption is you saw something that looked fairly human, but wasn't, either appeared and then disappeared inexplicably, or was doing something of a magical nature, or things like that. So by that definition, if we were looking at, say, like the Irish definition of fairy,
Mm.
a sprite would be a completely separate thing. That would be a little winged, because that kind of comes from English folklore.
Yeah.
Yeah, when it comes to seeing the little lights in the trees, like Adrian was saying, and like your story, and I talked to someone else that had a similar experience where they were in the woods and suddenly just everywhere, little glowing, flying beings.
Mhm.
Something
Yeah.
like that, I would probably call a sprite.
Yeah.
Just because that term, I think, fits a little better, but
Yeah.
it's very hard to specifically identify
Mhm.
what it actually is.
Mm. And there you have it. So okay, while we have, a little bit of time, we got a little bit of time left for sure. Most frequently asked questions. Modern times. Do you want to go there?
I mean, I can. Again, I don't know how not safe for work we want to make this.
Yeah, I'll leave it to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So definitely the most frequently asked question is just, is it possible for a human and a fairy to have physical relations?
Yes.
In which case my answer usually is, across the bulk of material we find, yes. We have a lot of stories of that sort of thing happening. Sometimes it's in a dream. Sometimes it's like appears physical or seems physical, depending on what story we're looking at, who we're talking to.
Yes.
The second most common question is definitely, can children be produced? Which, again, according to mythology and folklore and stories up until, even very recently, people that I've talked to, yes. Now, how you want to interpret that, I'm not going to tell you, but you personally, whether you want to decide that means that there was a physical insemination that occurred.
Yes.
I'm trying to choose my words really carefully here, that resulted in a child, or you want to take the more Irish mythology view that this was like a spiritual conception,
Yes.
that there was a physical baby was conceived, and then the spirit that was put into it is not human. However you want to interpret it,
Right.
but there certainly is a lot of material that would support that idea.
Right.
Yeah, and beyond that, we start to get into, people ask me a lot of very strange things about this topic.
But some of it like does make sense. Like in some of the human, let's say, transmitted problems when not using protection. Does this apply to fairies, or are they immune from stuff like that?
I have had people ask me that. To the
I know.
best
I read your book.
That final chapter gets real spicy.
Right.
To the best of my knowledge, from what I've seen across mythology, across the folklore, across modern accounts, there is no concept of like sexually transmitted diseases with fairies. They will certainly do their best to get you knocked up, So that's a big theme.
Well, but that's why they're here, right? Like they're not interacting with people because they just want to interact with people. It's usually for procreation of some sort.
Yeah, everything has everything has a purpose with them, and that's a big one for that particular thing. Yes, sexual habits of fairies. I've been asked a lot of very pointed questions about this. So the biggest risk when it comes to having sex with a fairy, according to all the stories and folklore and etc., is not that you're going to get some disease from it in any sense, but more that sometimes with some types of fairies, they seem to have a negative impact on the person's life force. So we do have stories of people who then like pine away or, waste away, who stop being able to sleep, who stop being able to eat. And, from there, usually they don't last very long. And the implication is kind of that this is because of this interaction with this fairy, that it did not work out well for the human in a more direct way. We see this in stories, particularly of things like the Genkana, more modern stories with those, the Lananshi, again, the more modern. There's like two different versions of both of those beings, sort of the older traditional view, which is not like this, and then the more modern view across the last 100 years, which very much is,
yes,
engage at your own risk kind of thing.
Yes.
So
it's actually like energy vampires, like, they just take your life force.
They drain your life force. But having said that, I should say that there is an older account from, I believe it's the 17th century, it might have been the 18th, of a man who had a fairy lover who accidentally almost killed him. She wasn't trying to. But, and this is, I'm kind of quoting the source here, not safe for work warning, that in the moment of orgasm, she inhaled. And when she inhaled while he was orgasming, she almost sucked his soul out. Yeah, which would have been bad for him.
Oh my God.
So,
like, oh my God.
Yes.
Okay, so he lived to tell about the encounter, obviously.
He did not actually die. And according to the story, she did feel bad. She wasn't trying to kill him.
Yes. Wow.
It sort of illustrates the risk that could sometimes be involved, because you have this non-human, supernatural, effectively being.
They're powerful.
Yes, and sometimes
it's a big chance it doesn't come with a warning label.
Yes, sometimes even unintentionally.
Yes.
They can have a negative impact on a human. So
yes.
Yeah.
Jesus. Okay. So poor guy. So Wayne says, what's the purpose of a fairy human hybrid?
So the vast majority of the time, the purpose seems to be that the fairies are trying to reproduce.
Yeah.
That they want more children. They don't have enough. They will also steal humans and then transform the human into a fairy in the stories. But a lot of times when it's actually like reproduction, a child is produced kind of stuff, the intent seems to be to have this child and then have that child be a fairy or join the fairies and that sort of thing. So usually, now we do also have some stories where the child stays in the human world, and it's a little less clear than what that purpose could be. It's funny now that we're saying this, I was talking to someone not too long ago, yesterday or the day before, and basically one of the things I was saying was that kind of like there's certain famous humans that were known to have a lot of children that like almost everyone can trace their ancestry back to, like Niall of Nine Hostages in Ireland. Or I think Charlemagne might be another one. There's a couple of famous people that had a lot of children who then also had a lot of children and so on. If we're talking about like, could you possibly have fairy ancestry based on the range of the stories, different family lines that claim to have this, pretty much everyone would be able to say, well, if you go back, enough, you're going to find someone with this connection. So, I suppose you could also argue that having these children in the human world is kind of spreading, I guess, genetics, DNA, however we want to look at it.
Well, I was going to ask, like, especially with the abilities. So let's say you have a fairy a child of two different parents, like the fairy parent and the human parent, they have children. Do those abilities keep going through? Or does that just phase out over time?
It seems to become more scattered over time.
Right.
So like the first couple of generations, like everyone, all the children, all the grandchildren, great grandchildren might have this extra ability or extra knowledge. And then it starts to become not all of them, fewer and fewer, but it still occasionally shows up. And I should say at this point that there are some witchcraft authors and some witchcraft traditions that believe that anyone who has psychic abilities or a penchant for witchcraft practice, magical abilities, again, however we want to term it today, is a person who has fairy blood. I am not saying that I personally believe that. I'm just putting it out there that like this is a belief you will find with some people. I have talked to people and I know almost nothing about this subject. So if you're going to question me, just know that in advance. There are some people who argue that people with Rh negative blood have fairy ancestry. I've also heard people say that's alien ancestry. So
but
I don't know anything about
one of the same, because a lot of it is really big in, Ireland, Scotland, even green eyes, the red hair. I mean, go back 30,000 years ago, it's brown-eyed, brown-haired people, right? Underneath this fake red hair is like real hair with a lot of red highlights. But
underneath
see,
the gray.
there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm negative blood type. I've got my eyes change colors, but they're like a funky green most of the time. So
I actually don't know what my blood type is. People ask me all the time. I've asked my doctor; he doesn't know.
I had to because I had to get a shot, so I had to.
Yeah.
So
I would have thought it was in my medical records, but I've asked, and
no, they don't. They don't do that here either. It's craziness. So
yeah, I guess it costs money. It's why they don't do it.
Not up here. It should be in the file because I mean, usually, like, and this is why I guess before people got married, they would do blood tests to make sure you were compatible.
Yeah.
Right, for blood type. So you would have to have that. It has to be in your records if you test to make sure, because otherwise you need to get a shot. So,
so I have no opinion on whether or not the
yes,
artists are being as fairies or aliens or whether, people who are psychic have fairy ancestry. I'm just putting that out there as like this, these are theories, these are beliefs that people have. So
I tend to believe everything is connected in one form or another. It's like Wayne says, there are some alien races that are trying to produce hybrid offspring, similar to the fairy situation, because something to do with their ability in some of these races, like the Greys, for example, to be able to keep their race going.
Yeah.
So I tend to wonder, like it is really fascinating.
There's a lot of crossover with fairy belief and aliens. And
yes.
I have a friend, Joshua Cutchin. He's written several books really about these topics, but I highly recommend his book Trojan Feast if you're curious about this. Because he gets into aliens and fairies and Sasquatch, and
I should put him in contact with me. I'd love to have him on as a referral from you.
Yeah. Well, I'll see if he's got the time.
Yeah, it'd be great. It'd be great.
And his book is fascinating because he talks about all of these things that are the same across these different beliefs, but one person has an encounter and they say it's aliens. Another person has a very similar encounter but says it's fairies. Yes. And then you put Sasquatch into it, and I didn't even realize how, because again, that's not my particular area of study. Yes. How much some of that stuff also resonates with or is similar to the fairies and the alien stuff. So some interesting things going on out there.
There is. It's the same with so many similarities with people who are having really malevolent paranormal encounters and extraterrestrial encounters, right down to smells and noises. Everything's almost exactly. Almost exact. So that it had me I've been an experiencer of both my whole life, but it had me questioning, what am I really experiencing? And I know a thing or two. And it left me scratching my head going, oh my God, could it have been this the whole time?
Yeah.
So
that's the crux of the fairies versus aliens argument, is that did historic people label it as fairies because that was the only way they had to understand it, even though it was aliens.
Yes.
Or
Yes.
do modern people call it aliens, even though it's actually fairies?
Yes.
Because now we have this sci-fi modern technology understanding of it. And I don't know. I'm not offering any answers. Sorry.
No, but it's you know what? It's all hypothesis. But I just love the, the documentation of the folklore, the oral history. Something, something happens and it got put out there orally and it stayed that way. And it's just, traversed like the spans of time. And here we are today talking about fairy unions. So it's all
And like
yeah.
you had said earlier, the fact that this persists,
Yes.
we've had these stories for so long. I mean, really,
Yes.
if you look at how long these stories have been going on, there's not many other things that are as consistent. Ghosts would probably be the main other one.
Yes.
And no matter how much we get into a rational, again, quote unquote, rational place of being like, this isn't true, this doesn't exist, this can't be real. And yet we still have experiences and we still have people believing this. And there's something about it that just really speaks to people, really resonates with people, so that it can't be explained away,
No, I would agree with you. And I think when you're looking at the paranormal and ghosts, it's the easiest thing for people to accept because most people have had, at least one paranormal encounter. Some may have and not recognize it. Some may have had multiple. But for the most part, I think you've either known somebody who's had experience, you've had an experience, or you've watched a show, that maybe resonates with you. I mean, it's a lot different than getting into, I think people look at these beings, as fairies and elves and kind of go, that's a little much.
You know what it is, honestly.
Yes.
The Victorians came along, the Victorian era came along.
They changed everything.
Yeah, and what they did was fairies prior to that, and still in a lot of different cultures, but in England and the US prior to that, were seen as dangerous, seductive, enchanting beings that you could potentially have a good experience with and good luck and all this, but also could potentially really mess you up. And the Victorians came along and turned fairies into the purview of children. They were the ones that really, because before that, you would not want fairies anywhere near children. There were all these protections to keep fairies away from children. They were known to steal them. It was a whole thing. And then the Victorians were like, no, actually, fairies are very childlike. Fairies are very similar to children. And children are very like fairies. And they sort of reduced the whole concept to
an innocence of sorts.
Yeah. And in such a way that then it became, well, if you're an adult, of course you don't believe in fairies. Of course you don't like fairies.
Well, wasn't it believed that adults couldn't even see fairies at one point, but only children could see them during this time?
Yep. We got into that corner. We got back to that corner, basically.
Yes.
Children will see and experience fairies, but then adults lose that ability once you're not innocent anymore. But what that really did, honestly, was it put us culturally in a place where for an adult to say they had seen a fairy or had a fairy experience or anything, they would kind of get mocked for it and laughed at and be like, oh, that's so childish. Like, what are you, 10?
Yeah. But you look at some places like Lilydale, for example, in upstate New York. I mean, they have a fairy forest. They build houses to them. They do tours. You go through the forest. You are educated on them. It's very interesting.
I think that that pendulum is starting to swing back a little bit, where it is starting to be a little more accepted, or at least understood as being a belief that people have that is not, a bad thing. It's not wrong to believe in fairies. It's not childish. But still, I find a lot of people just publicly aren't comfortable talking about it. You were saying you think everyone has had a ghost experience. I personally think everyone has had a fairy experience, but they either didn't know that's what was happening.
That would be me.
Or they
for the tree. Yeah. No, for sure. I mean, except for that tree, it sounds like it could have been, people are saying, "Oh, there's this fairies." I'm going, God, I've never, to my knowledge, had that experience, but I'll roll with it because I've seen a lot of things and I've never seen anything like that. And then it just went lights out.
And just done. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very
So
cool. I love that
I,
story.
it was amazing to me because it's just like, seeing a Christmas tree with all these tiny little white Christmas lights, how it's just all full, and it was just sort of glimmering a little bit. And I mean, so much so that I had to get right inside and say, "It's got to be like a stream
Yeah.
of light. There has to be something." And nothing. It just went off. I thought somebody in the house got to be just messing with it. Nothing. There was nothing, and it was just never happened before. Never happened again, like in my presence. So that's all I got. But
So if that happened around me, I would not even notice it, to be honest, because
really,
we
yeah, I
have,
love it.
we have fireflies here where I live.
Well, we
lightning.
have fireflies as well, but I've never seen them took that. Never.
Yeah.
There's too many. Way
Yeah.
too
Oh no,
many.
that's fair. I'm just saying, me
Yeah.
personally, I'm gonna immediately be like,
Yeah.
fireflies.
Yeah, I love fireflies. I mean, we
Yeah.
have a lot of them up here, but I shook that
But let's
tree,
see.
Morgan. If I could have ripped it out, just come on. There was nothing. Nothing came
Yeah.
out. Not a firefly, not a beetle. I mean, nothing.
Oh, I
It was
believe you.
crazy.
I believe you. I have another person
Yeah.
that I had talked to that does not live where there are fireflies that had the exact same thing happen. And
Yes.
it was like literally all of a sudden all these sparkling, twinkling little lights in the
Yeah.
air. I think it was around a bush, but I would have to double check with her because I don't totally remember.
Yeah.
But she had the same moment of like, what is happening? Like,
I am so grateful that there were so many other people on this tour, because it's just good to have other people say, "Oh my gosh, we're all acknowledging the same thing." So I don't
yeah.
feel like that guy. Does anybody else see this?
Oh, no.
Because holy crap.
I get it. The majority,
Yeah.
if you ask me to tell about fairy experiences I've had,
Yes.
I will almost always tell one of the handful of stories where there were other people there
Yes.
who also saw it.
Yeah.
Because there's that, like, this is not just me. Someone
Yeah.
else did this too.
It's not just me. That's right. A lot of other people. It's important. So, okay, where can everybody buy your book? I know I have a link to it in the description, but you may have other spots.
Yeah. So I mean, Amazon sadly is the main go-to for a lot of people. Barnes and Noble. My publisher's website, collectiveinc.com, I think. I should probably know that from memory, but
It's in the description.
yeah.
You can find it. Yeah.
If you click on the book on my publisher's website, they will give you links to different places you can get it. You can buy the ebook directly from my publisher. If you want the ebook, the paperback, you have to go through certain specific outlets.
Yes.
And you can always ask a brick and mortar store. I'm a huge fan of go to your physical location.
Yes.
If they don't have it, they should be able to get it. My publisher does distribute in North America. And obviously they're UK based, so obviously they do in the UK.
Yes. Yes.
So if you go into a store and ask, like, can you get this book by this author? Usually they can. So
excellent. And do you have any other books coming up?
Always.
Perpetually. Do you want to tell? Yeah, can you tell?
Yeah, so really quickly, I have a book called Pantheon the Irish, which is part of a series my publisher does on different pantheons. That's coming out in September. It's sort of a basic overview of Irish pagan belief and then Irish gods and spirits. I translate Old and Middle Irish as my super fun hobby. So I actually have a book coming out through Moon in October, which is a collection of my translation work. And then for people who are interested in either the Wild Hunt or the Scottish fairy courts, I have books on those coming out next year.
Ooh, we're definitely going to have to do that. Well, I also have like another idea too, so I'll just message you.
Yeah, you know where to find me.
Yeah, I'll find you. Yeah, I love it. I love it.
The Wild Hunt book was really fun to write because I thought I knew a lot about the Wild Hunt.
Yes.
And then I started researching for the book and I was learning all sorts of new things. So
you know what?
Fun.
Yeah, that might be fun even around like October.
Yeah. Wild
you
hunt
know,
season.
yeah, or even around Christmas if it's because the wild hunt is in December. So even like maybe sometime in the beginning of December, if you have it out, no pressure.
Um, I I don't think it's coming out until next, I want to say next summer.
Okay, well, we'll have to all wait then. That's fine.
Yeah,
It's
it's in
okay.
the queue. It's in the queue.
Yeah,
It'll get
no, I
there.
love it. I love it.
Mm. Yeah, the
Yeah,
Fairy Courts book will be out next March, and
right.
the Wild Hunt book is behind that in
Yes.
line. So
Well, there's a lot to look forward to coming from you. And like I said, I do have an idea, so I will message you on it. And thank you so much for showing up tonight with this incredible book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was such a treat getting it. I was kind of like, oh, I get dips at first. Awesome. It was good. And I have to say, there was some of it I was kind of like, oh my goodness.
that's how I felt
Let me
writing it.
get some wine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was
Yeah.
some when I was writing it where I was like, "Oh my."
I know. It's just like, oh boy, this is something. So this was a the uncensored version of the book, but it
Yes.
was amazing. You're just gonna have to go and get the book and then get the full on with it. But it was definitely it was a joy to read, and it's been great talking about it. And thank you for sharing it all with us.
Awesome. Yeah. No, I'm glad you enjoyed it, and
Good.
always have a good time coming on here and chatting with you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, let's see if we can get you on again one more time this year and get into or twice, You have a lot of books. So,
You know, I will say really quickly because I know you got to wrap up the show, but this is what I do for a living. I don't
yes.
have a 9 to 5 job.
Yes.
I write,
Yes.
which is how I'm able to be so productive.
Yes.
For anyone thinks
Yes.
out there I'm like never sleeping.
Yes.
No, this is
Yes.
what I do every day. Well,
Good.
almost every day.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. So there's
so
definitely good things coming. And there's a lot of things too that I've been perusing and it's giving me some ideas. So
awesome.
we'll definitely explore those.
Yeah. Like I said, you know where to find me.
All right, my darling. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Morgan. Well, everyone, thank you all for tuning in tonight. Everybody in the chat, you guys are just so fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Always a pleasure. Big thank you to Morgan. Next week, guys, on Beyond the Outer Realm, which is the new show on Tuesday afternoon, 2 p.m. Eastern. Priscilla Rosado Cruz joins us, and we'll be discussing the matrix in astrology. She really nails it home. So this is going to be good. Wednesday is going to be a little bit of birthday fun because, myself, Preston, Dennett, and Dolly Saffron all pretty much are within like 3 days of each other. We all follow one another. And we thought it would be fun to invite a few of the other hosts on that you all know and love to join us just for just a big open discussion. So it'll be like a big UPRN host discussion. It'll be a lot of fun. And that's going to be on Wednesday. Thursday, the return of Nathaniel Gillis, dear friend. I love him. He's knowledgeable. We're going to be talking about skin sigils, ritual manifestations, and magical practices. And he there's lots of questions when Nathaniel gets a hold of a topic, and he answers a lot of questions and leaves us all hanging. So he's booked for Thursday. You won't want to miss it. So in the meantime, everybody have a terrific weekend, and we shall see you all on Tuesday afternoon for Beyond the Outer Realm. Thank you all, and good night.